In 1976, a shy, socially awkward engineer sat alone in a cubicle late into the night, quietly designing the circuit board that would become the first Apple computer. His name was Steve Wozniak. He built it by himself, without a team, without a meeting, without anyone watching. It was only afterward that a magnetic, talkative young man named Steve Jobs saw what he had built and understood how to sell it to the world. Ask most people today who built Apple and they will describe someone like Jobs: confident, persuasive, impossible to ignore in a room. Almost no one describes the person who actually built the machine, working alone in silence for months. Susan Cain opens her book with exactly this kind of story, because it captures the argument she spends the rest of it proving. Modern culture has quietly convinced itself that the loudest person in the room is the most capable one, and in doing so, it has misjudged, undervalued, and actively mistrained a significant portion of the population, not because they lack ability, but because their ability does not announce itself the way extroversion does. Cain's central claim is direct. Introversion is not shyness, and it is not a deficiency to be corrected. It is a fundamental, biologically rooted temperament, present in roughly a third to half of the population, that processes stimulation, social interaction, and reward differently than extroversion does. Where an extrovert is energized by external stimulation, an introvert is often overstimulated by the same conditions, and does their best thinking in exactly the quiet, low-arousal environments that contemporary work culture has spent the last several decades systematically eliminating. In this video, I want to walk through the argument in real depth, not just the headline claim that introverts are underrated, which most people have already heard in some watered-down form, but the actual evidence Cain builds it on, the specific mechanism she describes, and where, honestly, the book's claims are stronger in some places than others. This is a longer, more detailed breakdown than usual because the subject deserves it. Stay with me. The extrovert ideal. Cain begins by nomming the cultural assumption most people have never consciously examined. She calls it the extrovert ideal, the pervasive belief, especially strong in American culture, that the best version of a person is gregarious, comfortable in groups, quick to speak, and energized by constant social contact. She traces this shift historically. 19th century advice literature, she notes, was preoccupied with character, inner virtue, moral seriousness, the kind of qualities that do not require an audience to exist. By the early 20th century, as American life urbanized and people increasingly had to make quick impressions on strangers in cities and workplaces rather than being known slowly over years in small communities, the emphasis shifted decisively toward personality, charm, magnetism, the ability to dominate a room on first meeting. This is not a minor rhetorical shift. It changed what an entire culture treats as evidence of competence. The specific consequence Cain identifies is that this cultural preference quietly became institutionalized. Business schools began grading class participation as a proxy for leadership potential. Open-plan offices were built on the assumption that visible, constant interaction produces better ideas than solitary concentration. School classrooms were rearranged into pods of desks facing each other, optimized for group discussion, at exactly the developmental stage when many children most need uninterrupted, quiet focus to actually learn. None of this, Cain argues, was ever demonstrated to produce better outcomes. It became standard practice because it matched a cultural preference that had already been mistaken for an objective measure of ability, and once embedded in institutions, it became nearly invisible as a choice at all. She traces the origin of this shift to a specific cultural figure she calls the salesman, embodied historically by people like Dale Carnegie, whose early career failures as a shy, self-conscious young man led him to develop, and eventually teach, an entire system for projecting confidence and charm on command. Carnegie's success in popularizing that system is itself part of Cain's evidence. An entire industry of self-improvement grew up around the premise that personality, not character, was the thing worth cultivating, and that premise, more than a century old now, still quietly shapes what modern workplaces reward without most people realizing where it originally came from. The new groupthink. This is where Cain's argument becomes most directly practical and most useful for anyone managing a team or designing how work actually gets done. She examines the modern obsession with collaboration, specifically the belief that brainstorming in groups, thinking out loud together, and open office environments reliably produce better ideas than individuals working alone. The research she cites tells a different story. Studies going back decades on group brainstorming consistently find that individuals working alone and later pooling their ideas generate more, and often better, ideas than the same number of people brainstorming together in real time. The mechanisms are specific. In group settings, social loafing lets some participants coast on the effort of others. Production blocking means only one person can speak at a time, while everyone else's train of thought is interrupted waiting for their turn. And evaluation apprehension, the simple fear of sounding foolish in front of colleagues, quietly suppresses exactly the unconventional ideas that groups claim to be seeking. Cain is careful here. She does not argue that collaboration is worthless. Certain kinds of complex, interdependent work genuinely benefit from real-time group interaction, and she credits collaboration with real value under the right conditions. Her argument is narrower and more precise. The specific practice of treating constant, visible group interaction as inherently superior to solitary, focused work is not supported by the evidence. And organizations that eliminate private space entirely, on the assumption that openness alone produces innovation, are quietly degrading the conditions under which a significant share of their most capable people do their best thinking. She points to the physical redesign of offices as the clearest evidence of how far this assumption has traveled unexamined. Walls come down, desks face each other. Phone booths and quiet rooms are treated as afterthoughts rather than necessities. The justification offered is almost always the same, that visibility and proximity spark spontaneous idea exchange. Yet Cain notes that the employees most likely to report genuine job satisfaction and sustained output in these environments tend to be the ones already inclined toward extroversion, while a meaningful share of the workforce quietly adapts by wearing headphones, arriving early to claim quiet hours, or working from home whenever the option exists, an informal workaround for a problem the office design itself created. The biology of temperament. Cain does not rest her argument on cultural observation alone. She spends a significant portion of the book on the research of psychologist Jerome Kagan, whose decades-long longitudinal studies tracked infants from 4 months old into adulthood, measuring what he called high reactivity. The specific finding is striking. Roughly 20% of infants, when exposed to new stimuli, unfamiliar smells, sudden sounds, novel objects, reacted with pronounced physical distress, arching their backs and crying vigorously. Kagan predicted, and later confirmed through follow-up studies over many years, that these high-reactive infants were significantly more likely to grow into quiet, cautious, introverted adults, while low-reactive infants, who stayed placid under the same stimulation, more often grew into sociable, bold, extroverted ones. Cain uses this to make a specific, important argument. Introversion is not, for a meaningful portion of people who have it, a set of habits acquired through shyness or bad social experience. It appears to be rooted in differences in amygdala sensitivity present from infancy, meaning the nervous system of a highly reactive child is, quite literally, wired to register more of the world as significant and worth pausing over, for better and for worse, than a low-reactive child's is. This matters because it reframes what is happening when an introverted employee hesitates before speaking in a meeting, or when an introverted child needs longer to warm up in a new classroom. It is not necessarily a confidence problem to be corrected with encouragement. It may be a nervous system doing exactly what it is built to do, processing more deeply before acting, and that depth of processing in the right context is frequently the source of the same person's most careful, well-considered thinking. Cain extends this with a useful metaphor borrowed from later temperament researchers, the distinction between orchids and dandelions. Dandelion children, typically the low reactive, more extroverted ones, tend to thrive in a wide range of environments, resilient regardless of the quality of their upbringing or surroundings. Orchid children, the high reactive ones, are far more sensitive to environmental conditions, wilting under stress and neglect but often flourishing, sometimes exceptionally under attentive, supportive conditions. The clinical implication is significant. The same underlying sensitivity that makes a high-reactive child more vulnerable to poor conditions is often the very trait that produces extraordinary outcomes when the conditions are good, meaning sensitivity itself is neither a liability nor an asset in isolation. It is a heightened responsiveness to context, for better or worse, depending entirely on what that context provides. Free trait theory. One of the more nuanced ideas in the book addresses a fair objection. If temperament is this biologically rooted, how do introverted people manage to give public talks, run meetings, or perform well in roles that seem to demand extroverted behavior? Cain draws on psychologist Brian Little's free trait theory to answer this. People are capable of acting out of character, temporarily and convincingly, when doing so serves what Little calls a core personal project, something they genuinely care about. An introverted professor can deliver an animated, engaging lecture for an hour, not because the lecture reveals their true temperament, but because teaching well matters enough to them to justify the performance. The specific catch, and this is the part Cain emphasizes most, is that this kind of acting out of character carries a real cost. It draws down a finite reserve of energy, and it requires what she calls restorative niches afterward, deliberate periods of solitude and quiet to recover what the performance spent. An introvert who gives a talk and then immediately attends a crowded reception, with no recovery time built in between, is operating on borrowed energy that eventually runs out, often manifesting as irritability, exhaustion, or a kind of social burnout that looks, from the outside, like a personality failure rather than what it actually is, which is a resource management problem. Cain is specific about what a restorative niche actually looks like in practice, and it varies considerably from person to person. For some, it is literal physical solitude, a closed door and an empty room. For others, it is a smaller, more predictable form of retreat, a solo walk between meetings, lunch eaten alone rather than in a crowded cafeteria, headphones signaling unavailability without requiring an explanation. The common thread is not the specific activity, but the function it serves. A deliberate pause in stimulation long enough for the nervous system to reset before the next demand for out-of-character performance arrives. Cultural variation. Cain broadens the argument beyond individual temperament to examine how different cultures assign value to quietness itself. She spends considerable attention on Asian and Asian American contexts, noting that many East Asian cultural traditions treat quiet listening, modesty, and thoughtful restraint as marks of wisdom and respect, almost the direct inverse of the extrovert ideal dominant in American culture. This creates a specific, documented friction. Asian American students and professionals, she reports, frequently describe a mismatch between the communication style they were raised to value and the one rewarded in American classrooms and workplaces, where speaking up quickly and often is read as engagement and competence, while careful silence is misread as disinterest or lack of preparation, regardless of the actual thinking happening underneath it. The broader point Cain is making is that the extrovert ideal is not a universal, objective standard of human excellence. It is a specific cultural preference, historically recent even within the West, and treating it as though it measures something innate about competence or leadership potential systematically undervalues people and entire cultural traditions that were never operating by the same rules to begin with. She illustrates this with observations from university settings, describing talented students who arrive fluent in a communication style built around careful listening and deference to more experienced voices, only to be graded down on participation rubrics that treat frequent, assertive speaking as the primary evidence of engagement. The students are not lacking insight. They are operating according to a different, equally coherent set of norms about when speaking adds value and when it does not. And an institution that only recognizes one of those norms is not measuring ability. It is measuring conformity to a specific cultural style and mistaking that conformity for merit. Quiet leadership. Cain challenges directly the assumption that leadership requires extroversion, using Rosa Parks as her central example. Parks is often remembered through an image of bold defiance, but Cain describes her, based on those who knew her, as soft-spoken, private, and famously reluctant to draw attention to herself. Her refusal to give up her seat was not an act of loud rebellion. It was quiet, deliberate, and unmistakably firm, precisely the combination Cain argues quiet leadership often looks like in practice. Influence built on conviction and consistency rather than volume. The research she cites on leadership outcomes adds weight to this. In several studies of team performance, introverted leaders were found to produce better results specifically when managing proactive, highly engaged team members, because they were more inclined to listen to and implement good ideas from the team rather than dominating the direction themselves. The opposite pattern from extroverted leaders working with the same kind of proactive teams. The lesson is not that introverted leadership is universally superior. It is that the default assumption that the most talkative person in the room is automatically the best suited to lead it does not hold up once actual outcomes are measured rather than assumed. Cain extends this into a broader observation about how organizations select for leadership in the first place. Promotion decisions, she notes, are frequently made based on who is most visible and vocal in meetings, a proxy that correlates with confidence far more reliably than it correlates with judgment. The result is a systematic filtering effect, where genuinely capable, quieter candidates are passed over repeatedly, not because their thinking was weaker, but because the evaluation process was never built to notice thinking that does not announce itself out loud. Parenting and relationships. The second half of the book turns from institutions to something more intimate, how temperament differences play out inside families and romantic relationships. And this is where Cain's advice becomes most personal. For parents of introverted children, her central caution is against a well-meaning but corrosive pattern, treating a child's quietness as a problem to be fixed through constant pushing toward more social exposure. She argues instead for what she calls a middle path, gently encouraging a child to stretch beyond their comfort zone in areas that matter to them, while protecting ample quiet time as a legitimate need rather than a phase to be outgrown. A child pushed too hard, too constantly, toward extroverted behavior does not typically become more extroverted. They more often learn that their natural temperament is a source of disappointment to the people they depend on most, a lesson Cain treats as one of the more quietly damaging things a well-intentioned parent can teach. For couples where one partner is introverted and the other extroverted, a common and often difficult pairing, she describes a recurring source of friction that has little to do with compatibility in the usual sense, and everything to do with mismatched needs for stimulation and recovery time. The extroverted partner reads the introverted partner's need for solitude as rejection or lack of interest. The introverted partner reads the extroverted partner's need for constant social contact as inability to simply be still together. Cain's specific recommendation is naming the pattern explicitly, as a difference in temperament rather than a verdict on the relationship, which she finds tends to diffuse a surprising amount of recurring conflict once both partners understand what is actually happening underneath it. Now let us be honest about this book. Cain writes with genuine narrative skill, and the mix of hard psychological research with vivid personal profiles is a large part of why the book became as influential as it did. That said, the book has drawn substantive criticism worth engaging with seriously rather than glossing over. The introvert and extrovert categories, as Cain presents them, sometimes flatten what psychologists generally treat as a continuous spectrum into something closer to two fixed types, when most people's actual temperament sits somewhere in between, a position often called ambiversion. Cain acknowledges this distinction exists, but the book's narrative momentum, built around clear contrasts and vivid character portraits, tends to pull the reader toward thinking in binary terms more than the underlying research strictly supports. There is also a fair critique regarding generalizability. A meaningful share of the research Cain draws on, including Kagan's foundational studies, comes from relatively narrow populations, and translating findings about infant temperament directly into sweeping claims about adult workplace behavior, decades removed from the original data, involves interpretive leaps that Cain presents with more narrative confidence than the underlying science always fully supports on its own. Finally, some readers and reviewers have noted that the book's practical advice, useful as far as it goes, occasionally reduces a genuinely complex biological and cultural phenomenon into a tidier self-help narrative than the science underneath it actually is, particularly in sections addressing parenting and relationships, where individual variation among introverted people themselves is considerable and not always fully reflected in the general advice offered. There is a further tension worth nomming between the book's two central modes. In its research-driven chapters, Cain writes with real scientific caution, careful to note where findings are preliminary or contested. In its more narrative chapters, built around individual profiles and personal anecdotes, that caution loosens considerably, and vivid stories are sometimes allowed to carry more persuasive weight than the underlying data alone would support. This is a common feature of popular psychology writing generally, not a flaw unique to this book, but it means a careful reader benefits from distinguishing which claims rest on replicated research and which rest primarily on a well-told, individually compelling example. None of this undermines the book's central, well-supported claim. Temperament differences are real, meaningfully rooted in biology, and systematically undervalued by institutions built around a narrow cultural preference for extroversion. It simply means the most responsible way to apply the book's ideas is to hold the big picture claim with confidence, while treating some of the more specific, sweeping generalizations with appropriate caution. So what do you actually take from this? The first and most practical takeaway is architectural, in both the literal and organizational sense. If you manage people, or manage your own work, the quality of thinking that happens depends heavily on whether quiet, uninterrupted conditions are actually available, not assumed to be unnecessary, because open collaboration looks more productive from the outside. Protecting solitude is not indulgence. For a significant share of any group of capable people, it is the specific condition under which their best work becomes possible at all. The second takeaway concerns self-knowledge rather than environment. If you recognize yourself as someone who performs well in public roles but returns from them depleted rather than energized, that is not a contradiction to resolve or a weakness to push through indefinitely. It is free trait behavior exactly as Cain describes it, and it requires the recovery time it is asking for, built into the schedule deliberately rather than granted only after exhaustion forces the issue. The third takeaway is about how you judge other people, particularly in professional settings. Quietness in a meeting is not evidence of a lack of ideas, preparation, or ambition. It is frequently evidence of a different processing style, one that arrives at conclusions through internal reflection rather than external verbalization. And a room that only rewards the second style is quietly discarding a substantial share of its best thinking before it is ever heard. The fourth takeaway applies specifically to anyone raising children or navigating a relationship with a very different temperament from their own. The mismatch itself is not the problem. Misreading the mismatch as rejection, disinterest, or a character flaw is. A quiet child who needs an hour alone after school is not signaling unhappiness with the day. A partner who wants a silent evening in is not signaling disinterest in the relationship. Naming the actual pattern accurately tends to resolve far more friction than either partner pushing harder against a difference that was never going to disappear through effort alone. That is the actual case this book makes, argued with real evidence and real nuance beneath its more popular, simplified reputation. Not that introverts are secretly superior to extroverts, which was never the claim. That an entire class of genuine capability has been culturally miscoded as deficiency for long enough that almost no one thought to question it. Thanks for watching all the way through. The quietest person in the room was never the one with nothing to say. They were simply the one waiting for a culture willing to listen.